Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Cory Hughes' Bloody History. Today, we are going to take another dive into the Jim Garrison papers, specifically a file only marked Central Intelligence Agency. So, despite the fact that Garrison worked on this case for a decade or more, the idea that this file should only have around 32 pages in it is fucking ridiculous. But if you didn't know, the Garrison papers we have today are highly edited. The original Garrison papers, I'm convinced the vast majority of them that had really damning stuff in it beyond what I discovered. A lot of that stuff is gone. Garrison figured out most of what had happened. He put Kerry Thornley and David Ferry in Dallas, as he should have. He put Arcacha in Dallas. He put Santana in Dallas. He put everyone in Dallas. He knew what time it was. He just didn't really... he didn't work out the fine details. He didn't figure out everything. He didn't really, I don't think, got the right idea of what happened with the other mobsters from out of town, or Jack Valenti. But he was on to David Ferry and his New Orleans crew, that's for sure. So this file, I don't recall what's in this. I've read through all of the Garrison papers at one point or another. Some I paid less attention to than others, and I think this is one of the ones that I really kind of just skimmed over. So a lot of this might be new to me as well. So let us begin. It begins with a memorandum, April 15th, 1969, to Andrew J. Sciambra, Assistant DA, from Alberto Fowler, in regards to a telephone conversation of 4/14/69 with Harold Weisberg. In the upper right-hand corner, in looks like Garrison's handwriting, there are some notes. Reference extreme right wing, reference Oswald, reference Cuba, William Gaudet and Latin American report. I don't recall if we talked too much about William Gaudet on this show or not, but Gaudet was clearly someone who was working directly for the CIA. He was handling all their Latin American propaganda and some covert actions. Who knows what the covert actions were? But Gaudet was certainly at least keeping an eye on Oswald and the activities in New Orleans. He also happened to get his visa to go to Mexico City the same day, allegedly, that Lee Harvey Oswald got his visa to go to Mexico City. But of course it wasn't Oswald. It was Kerry Thornley. Earlier that day, another associate of David Ferry's, David Pierce Magyar, if I'm not mistaken, is a pilot. He also got a visa to go to Mexico City. I believe it was the 17th of September, 1963. So those three men, allegedly, all got visas to Mexico City around the same time period for travel, that is. All on the same day, in September 17th, 1963. In a facility that actually ended up burning down. And then relocated to the consulate, which relocated to the Trade Mart, the International Trade Mart, run by Clay Shaw. So, you will see the connections in New Orleans, particularly with Gaudet and Jesse Core, who was a PR man for Clay Shaw, and John Corporan of WDSU, You'll see how all of them were responsible for getting Oswald on television. Obviously, all of them work with the CIA. Funny because the CIA isn't supposed to operate in America. They never have been allowed to operate in America, but of course they operate in America, making them an illegal operation. So this first document here from Alberto Fowler to Andrew Scambra, the assistant to Jim Garrison, is in reference to Mr. Bill Gaudet. So let's see what it has to say. With reference to the telephone conversation I had yesterday with Mr. Harold Weisberg, among the things that we discussed was the fact that Mr. Bill Gaudet, editor and publisher of Latin American Reports, with offices in the International Trade Mart, was, according to Mr. Weisberg, investigated by the FBI prior to Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Mexico. Mr. Weisberg maintains that Mr. Gaudet was an ex-CIA agent, and I mentioned to Mr. Weisberg that among the Cuban colonies it had been often reported to me that Mr. Gaudet had either been an FBI or CIA agent. Mr. Weisberg told me that he has copies of the FBI report, and what I thought was most interesting was the fact that neither his office address nor his home address in New Orleans appear in the report, but an out-of-town address in Louisiana with only a postal box number, which of course seemed to have been omitted intentionally not to bring out the International Trade Mart address. Mr. Weisberg also claims that in the old International Trade Mart building, Mr. Gaudet's offices were always adjacent to vacant rooms, and that now in the new Trade Mart building, this is also so. I told Mr. Weisberg that I did not know this, but that it would be quite easy to check, since I had been in that office numerous times but did not notice if they were adjacent to vacant rooms or not. Mr. Weisberg also pointed out that it was interesting that Mr. Gaudet's partner, Bill Angers of Lafayette, Louisiana, a well-known right-wing extremist, was now his new partner. I mentioned to Mr. Weisberg that I had met Mr. Angers years before in Guatemala, and at the time I was quite convinced that he was an FBI agent undercover of some sort. At the time, Mr. Angers was very involved in the anti-Castro movement, and he still is, as most of his publications, he writes a column in the Lafayette paper, indicate. All right, so Mr. Gaudet works with the CIA. He admits that in an interview he does with Bernard Fensterwald. I might have covered it here. I covered it somewhere. I read through the 50 or 60 page interview of Mr. Gaudet where he discusses this. He admits to have been a CIA contract agent, but Mr. Gaudet, when you come to see the scope of his employment, it goes back to the OSS days. So he was most certainly not a contract agent. He was an employee. The OSS is so important in the history of intelligence and the CIA. The precursor, really the only independent intelligence I believe that we've ever had, if it was even considered independent, because of the influence of the British, but also in the 30s, in the beginnings of the war against Hitler, the cooperation with the Soviet propaganda unit, you could say that they played a major role in shaping OSS policy and how the OSS disseminated propaganda and what kinds of propaganda. So I'm going off on a tangent here, so I'll get back to Mr. Gaudet. But I think it's pretty obvious that Mr. Gaudet, who had been with the OSS during World War II, was clearly an employee. He was a big shot. Some speculate that he may have been Clay Shaw's boss, but you see, at that level, you kind of get this. Of course, everybody has a boss, but you get this kind of mesh network, like branches of a bush, right, with all these different handlers and agents all kind of intertwined with each other. So it's kind of hard to iron out these relationships sometimes. But yeah, the point I'm making is Mr. Gaudet, clearly CIA, and his relationship with the Trade Mart, which is CIA/Mossad. Remember, you can't really separate the CIA and the Mossad, ever. Certainly not in 1963. So, but when you trace the ownership of the Trade Mart, which is ironically the building in Dallas that Kennedy was supposed to speak at, that he was on his way to when he was killed, was owned by Permindex. This building here, this Trade Mart, was definitely CIA, but I don't recall if this one was Permindex. It was definitely Permindex related, but Permindex directly owned, I don't know. The one in Dallas, absolutely. Let me see. All right, moving on. Next, we have a memorandum, May 8th, 1966, reference John William Riley of the Riley Coffee Company and the CIA. So Riley Coffee Company is the front job that Oswald allegedly had, but don't believe he ever actually really worked there. All he had were front jobs. These guys are CIA agents, and all the jobs on paper that they had that cut their paychecks were CIA front companies that gave them cover to go do whatever spook stuff they were doing. Therefore, Riley Coffee Company, Ryder Coffee Company, these are all CIA fronts or CIA or companies that are run by ex-CIA agents who are friendly to the CIA and willing to do things like put people on payroll. This is to Jim Garrison from Stephen J. Burton, investigator, reference, interview of Gerald Patrick Hemming Jr., Jerry Hemming. So yeah, 2668 Hoyt Avenue, El Monte, California. At the time of the assassination, Jerry Hemming claims to have been living in Miami. There might be a photograph of him in Dealey Plaza. However, if there's a photograph of him in Dealey Plaza, he was clearly not a shooter. Therefore, I believe Jerry Hemming's involvement in the assassination. See, you can have knowledge of the assassination, knowledge is going on, but not be involved. And I think that's kind of the case with Hemming, because all these guys around him were involved, like Lauren Hall, like Lawrence Howard, and William Seymour, and Dick Watley, and Augustinovich, and all these fucking guys. Edwin Collins. So these guys all knew each other through Jerry Hemming's Interpen, which was run mostly out of No Name Key down in the Keys, but he also ran the Interpen group, ran the camps at Lake Pontchartrain that the FBI would eventually raid, and David Ferry was there, and they say Oswald was connected there, but again, never was it fucking Oswald. If they say Oswald was somewhere with any of these conspirators, you can guarantee it was Kerry Thornley. Or if it was in Dallas or a handful of places with, if he was seen with the Husky Latino, it was William Seymour. But we're going off track here. But this is an interview of Jerry Hemming. Very interesting guy. He knew fucking what time it was. He knew everybody. He knew Raoul. He knew all these fucking characters. He talks about him in various interviews. But, here we go. Synopsis. Of particular importance during our conversation were the following points. Bill Burchett, an associate of Bradley's, that would be Edgar Eugene Bradley, on the West Coast, flew Patrick, Frank Bartz, Louis Rebel, and Ricardo Davis to the North Shore of Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. The man in the photograph of the man arrested in Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 63, who bears resemblance to Edgar Eugene Bradley, is one Ted Slack. John William Riley of the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans worked for CIA for years. Okay, so I'm glad we came across the name of Ted Slack. Let's talk about Ted Slack for a minute, because I went nuts over the Three Tramps when I did the Three Tramps at the time, and I had looked into the possibility of the short tramp having been Ted Slack. Ted Slack is a name that pops up in association, not really so much with these guys that they're putting him with here, but I found Ted Slack associated with it was like the Minutemen or one of these organizations. He was darker skinned. I think he was part Cuban, like a half Cuban, but he lived in Florida, and he was somehow brought into, I think it was Jerry Hemming who brings his name into the fucking mix, which is purely diversionary. Purely because Ted Slack, I dug into this guy's life big time. There's a bunch of news articles I clipped on him. Maybe I'll dig them up and put them in a slide presentation or something. I've got them around here somewhere. But Ted Slack basically was irrelevant. Another name that I came across when investigating Ted Slack was Ralph Elmer Slafter, or Schlafter, because I've seen it spelled two different ways. Schlafter and Slafter. So it's one of the two. That guy I thought looked a whole lot like the Short Tramp too, but after digging into him, I had 4 or 5 suspects for the Short Tramp before I pulled my head out of my ass and realized the answer was right in front of me the entire time. But yeah, so the point I'm getting here is that Ted Slack has nothing to do with anything, and why Jerry Hemming ends up bringing him into this conversation, because I think I do have either read this or I've read another interview of Hemming where he talks about Ted Slack. But yeah, Slack ends up being irrelevant. Just like Slafter ended up being irrelevant. Interview on May 7, 1968, in the company of Lawrence Howard, I met with Gerald Patrick Hemming Jr., Jerry Patrick, at his home. Patrick acknowledged having known of almost everyone I asked him about. In most instances, he did no more than say, "Yeah, I knew him," and remain silent. A list of names is attached to this memorandum. Of possible importance was my observation that Patrick knows the current whereabouts of most of these people. I doubt that he would respond directly to a request for a location due to his extreme skepticism of the validity of our investigation. However, it is possible that Lawrence Howard could obtain some addresses for us. That's hilarious, considering Lawrence Howard was a shooter on the 6th floor. For example, Mikey McLaney is now in politics in the Bahamas. Eugene Lyons, American Committee to Free Cuba in Los Angeles, is in Idaho. Manuel Garcia Gonzalez is probably in the Honduras. Richard Butler, who introduced Howard to Colonel William P. Gale and Reverend Wesley A. Swift, is also in Idaho. William P. Gale, I looked into him a little bit. He was a weird definitely CIA-backed wackadoo fucking preacher, wore the collar and everything, ultra right-wing, associated with the Minutemen and all those fucking wackadoo fucking right-wing organizations of the time. Remember, rule number 1, don't join any fucking organizations. Patrick was shown a series of photographs. He identified a number of people whom he had known but declined to provide any information about them. See the attached list. Okay, so now on page 2 of this memo, we have a note, handwritten, probably by Jim Garrison. It says, "Note, Rich Lochley," which is a name that pops up periodically in the assassination, was aware they arrested in the something of summer of 1963 FBI raid on the can't read that something. Okay, so it's making a note reference to Richard Lochley, who's definitely a CIA guy connected to the Cuban stuff, and that's in the upper right hand corner. So we'll begin the memo here, page 2. When he was shown the series of photographs of men arrested in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963, Patrick identified the man who resembles Edgar Eugene Bradley as Ted Slack. Okay, so when he says the man who resembles Edgar Eugene Bradley, what he's really talking about in this context is the tall tramp. Edgar Eugene Bradley as Ted Slack, a former ONI reserve commander. That's totally false, by the way. This is a false trail he's laying down. Patrick would provide no further information and would not give his present location and would not speculate as to why Slack was evidently in Dallas in November of 1963. Patrick identified this man behind Slack, the one in the European-style jacket, as a person name unrecalled whom he had seen on Larry Laborde's ship, the L.C. Riker. Patrick also identified the man who appears in the DCA film, apparently in custody, as Marino, a man who was selling arms for Richard Lochley. Okay, now this is interesting. Patrick also identified the man who appears in the DCA film, apparently in custody, as Marino, a man who was selling arms for Richard Lochley. This is the photograph that has variously been identified as Lawrence Howard, Charles Brem, and others. Okay, so again, the DCA film, I can't recall if that's the one that shows the arrest of the man from behind the railroad yards being walked down into Dealey Plaza. But either way, you can rest assured that nothing Jerry Patrick Hemming is saying here is fucking true. He'll give you almost the truth. He'll tell you somebody who, if you investigated them, would be provably out of town, right? So that's what these guys are fucking... He knows what happened. He knows the deal. He might have been photographed in Dealey Plaza. He was most certainly aware of everything, and so he's just playing with these people at this point, which is kind of funny. But see, all the names in play here are relevant, like Lawrence Howard. Charles Brem, not so much. Patrick advised that John William Riley of the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans was working for the CIA for years. He also said that he knew Jim and Jerry Buchanan in Miami. These brothers advised the FBI that they had been in a fight in a park in Miami with Lee Oswald during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Patrick did not know of this incident, which appears to parallel a Fair Play for Cuba Committee literature distribution episode in New Orleans the following August. He said that Jerry Buchanan was on No Name Key in the early days, 60-61, and that he was acquainted with Alexander Rourke. A lot to unpack in this one paragraph here. So the Lee Oswald in Miami, we don't know that ever actually happened. But if it did, it wasn't Oswald. Oswald was most certainly not in fucking Miami at the time. He was not associated with... Actually, he was never in Miami. And he was definitely not associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee until the following May of 1963. So this is bullshit, right? So this is more of them being sloppy in the setup. Right. Remember, at this time, prior to the initiation of the planning of the assassination, I believe that all this stuff with Lee Oswald and the setting up of Oswald to make him look like a fucking communist was designed specifically to get him into Cuba. Right. He's back from Soviet Union. Now he's going to get into Cuba. That's the only thing that makes fucking sense, because they weren't planning on killing Kennedy in January of fucking 61. They just weren't. Was not in the works at that time. Not even hinted about amongst them. Alexander Rourke, we'll talk about another time. He's another one of these mid-level CIA employees, handled a bunch of people, ran propaganda newspapers, that kind of stuff, funded a bunch of stuff, was connected to, what was the fucking guy with the boat? Larry Laborde. We have a note here. Let's see if I can read it. My eyesight's getting worse. It looks like Burles is still in New Orleans, something, and cooperative attitude. Bart. No, he's not talking about Bart's. Frank Bart's. Patrick said that he recalls that a pilot named Bill Burchett flew him, Frank Bartz, Louis Rebell, Ricardo Davis, and others to the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain to scout the area for possible training camp. He said that Burchett knew Bartz well and lived at the time in Metairie. As you know, a man named Bill Burchett was evidently closely associated with Edgar Eugene Bradley's apparent activity at Van Nuys Airport. Because of the extreme importance of this possible link, the conversation is reproduced below in paragraph form. Okay, so another thing about Edgar Eugene Bradley is I'm pretty sure that it's been concluded that he was photographed in Dealey Plaza. There was some obfuscation with his name being mixed in with the Tramps, but that's obviously not the case. But he was also alleged to have been one of the men who claimed to have been Secret Service and presented Secret Service ID that day in front of the book depository. I've always found his story to be kind of a side story, rather irrelevant. There were a lot of gawkers there, a lot of people who knew what was going to happen, who were there to see it happen. He was definitely one of them. All right, so this is the conversation reproduced in paragraph form. Did you ever hear the name Bill Burchett? Yes, that name is familiar. Is he a pilot? Yes. Yeah, I think he flew us across Lake Pontchartrain. You know, there never was a training camp there. We looked around and planned to start one. We even had permission from the pastor of a church up there to use his property, but it never got started. Who was with you on that trip? Oh, Bartz, Rebell, Davis, maybe a few others. So here, he's saying that Patrick is saying that they never got the camp started, but that's not true because they busted the place and took all the arms. Unless that's just more wives' tale. Unless that's Kennedy lore, Kennedy fiction. Antonio, put that on the list of things we need to look into. Stat. Otherwise, regarding the New Orleans area, Patrick said that people in that area were used for arms pickup and delivery, boat acquisition and transport, etc. He said that little of the really militant action came out of people in that city. I think we're getting some disinformation here. All right, next memorandum. Reference CIA and defense of the, looks like, subjects of Orleans DA's JFK inquiry, May 24th, 1967, to Jim Garrison from William R. Martin, District Attorney's Office. Subject CIA agency connections in the city of New Orleans. Tuesday, May 23rd, 1967. I have this date kept a luncheon engagement with a close associate of mine whom I personally know to have been a former member of the Central Intelligence Agency and who has been a resident of New Orleans all of his adult life. That part is underlined. The purpose of this meeting was for me to receive information which the aforementioned individual would have volunteered as an aid to our investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Item 1. And there is a note in the column with an arrow to the name William Burke in the sentence. Had lunch reportedly with Andy Anderson recently. Item number 1. For many years, one William Burke was the agent in charge of the local New Orleans office of the CIA. Prior to his appointment to this office, Mr. Monty Lehman of the law firm of Monroe and Lehman was called upon or asked to pass or approve of Mr. Burke's appointment to that office. Subsequently today, Mr. Stephen B. Lemon of the same law firm in New Orleans is serving as special counsel to the CIA and does in fact handle certain matters pertaining to the clandestine payroll of the CIA in this city. Specifically, our information is that Mr. Stephen B. Lemon will advance funds to Mr. Plotkin and to Mr. Klein for the defense of their respective clients now under investigation by this office. This contains some very important information. This is going over CIA personnel in New Orleans around the time of the assassination who were involved with what? Payroll. Nobody does anything for free. Everybody gets paid. Therefore, the guy who would know everything is the guy in charge of payroll. So these names here, William Burke, Monty Lehman, Stephen Lemon, and then Plotkin and Klein, important names in reference to the CIA infrastructure in New Orleans at the time. Item number 2. One Dave Baldwin, formerly of this city and a former newspaper reporter for the New Orleans Item, was a covert member of the Central Intelligence Agency and operated in India during the years of 1950, 1951, and 1952. Subsequent to his service in India, Mr. Baldwin returned to this city and was employed by Clay Shaw as Public Relations Director for the International Trade Mart from 1952 through 1955. Mr. Baldwin is now in Chicago, employed by the American Medical Association Political Action Committee. The CIA involved with the AMA. Never could have guessed it. It was told to me that during his employment at the Trade Mart, David Baldwin succeeded in recruiting Clay Shaw for CIA operations. Or, conversely, that Clay Shaw had already been recruited by the CIA by the time of Baldwin's employment, and that his employment of Baldwin was suggested or sponsored by the CIA. Well, we know Clay Shaw was CIA going back to 47 and that he was OSS during World War II. Lifelong employee. Possibly contract agent at the time of the assassination because he had so many other things going on. During his operations in India, Mr. Baldwin used as a cover his employment as a correspondent for North American Newspaper Alliance, the Louisville Courier Journal, and the New Orleans Item. Good to know that those outlets were CIA operations. Comments and opinions. I consider the foregoing information to be relatively accurate, although unconfirmed by my personal investigation. I am unfortunately too well known to and associated with any of the above-mentioned names to verify this information and would recommend, therefore, that should you see fit to pursue any of the above, that it be assigned to another member of our staff. Next memorandum. Reference Ferry, reference CIA. And it says plus Brownlee file, talking about Morris Brownlee. November 8th, 1967, Jim Garrison, District Attorney, to Jim Garrison from Harold Weisberg, reference Morris Brownlee. Morris Brownlee is, I believe, a deeply disturbed young man. While pretending to himself that he is cooperating with you, fully knows very well he is and has been holding out. I believe he is disturbed because inwardly, this is really not what he wants. I took a rather unusual tack with him in a long post-midnight meeting early this morning. The most interesting thing he acknowledged was that David Ferry had told him that Ferry was CIA. Because of the approach I took, I went with the whole cake, not just cookies. I refused to pressure this and told him exactly why. If you have time, I will tell you in the whole story, but I think it is possible to unlock him and to get him to the point where he consciously desires this. He asked for my address. I gave it to him, and we have an understanding that prior to my return, he will make a long series of notes, and when I return, we will have a long tape-recorded interview. This may sound strange, and indeed it may be, but I believe it is the only manner in which what he really knows and what he really believes can be elicited. Time will tell. It's from Harold Weisberg. Now, let me comment real quick on Morris Brownlee. I can tell you with 100% certainty, Brownlee had been an alias that was at one time used by Leighton Martins. Leighton Martins also used the alias of Melvin Coffey. Now, there is a real Morris Brownlee who was in like the CAP and associated with David Ferry and all this stuff and that New Orleans crew. However, remember, guys who were not involved in the assassination, like Melvin Coffey, had their names borrowed as aliases to use because that's how the alias game works. Aliases are typically real names of people that you know that are shared amongst a group of people so they can never know exactly who the fuck was where when they do the investigation. Because the name was shared amongst various people and they can prove the real person was somewhere else. So they know it wasn't them, right? That's why they do this. But Morris Brownlee only came up as name that was used as alias and maybe some alibi stuff. But I never saw any direct involvement in the assassination by Brownlee. I know Arcacha had an association with Morris Brownlee, but it never stood out as anything other than incidental. All right, next we have some clippings from the newspaper, reference Shaw and Centro Mundial Comercial. Damn it. It's sideways and I don't feel like kinking my head. Let me see if I can pull out some highlights. It says Novell says munitions theft set up by agency. He's talking about the Homa bunker. It absolutely was set up by the agency and the Schlumberger Corporation. Evidence links CIA to DA probe. All right. Talks about the CIA and how Jim Garrison's doing a probe. Even the investigation's pivotal figure, the 54-year-old Clay Shaw, has CIA connections and attributed him. Shaw, charged with complicity in Kennedy's death, was linked with the CIA. Influential Italian newspaper, that's Pesa Sera. Pesa Sera did an amazing job. By 67, 68, they had linked Clay Shaw and David Ferry to CMC and Permindex and the fucking Israelis and the whole kit and caboodle. Pravda also. Props on Pravda. The Russian alleged propaganda newspaper that was probably more truthful than the New York Times has ever been. All right, I'm going to skip over to this other part that's not sideways. The charges against Novell and Arcacha are spin-offs from Garrison's main investigation, talking about the charges he put on them in 67 for the 62 burglary of the ammunitions dump at Homa. The prosecutor has called Novell a very important witness and has filed a material witness warrant against him. Novell, who has to be one of history's most loquacious fugitives, I hate when people use big words for the sake of using big words, has carried on a running long-distance feud with the man who wants him to do his talking before a grand jury. He repeatedly has called Garrison's investigation a fraud and a fiction. He has held a number of press conferences and submitted himself to a series of lie detector, truth serum, and psychological tests to prove he is telling the truth. A psychologist at Columbus says mental tests indicate he is. It's funny how the newspaper is so quick to jump to the defense of all the people who are involved. To polygraph operators and to friends and associates, Novell has said the munitions burglary was no burglary at all, but a war materials pickup made at the direction of his CIA contact. Publicly, Novell called the munitions incident the most patriotic burglary in history during a recent news interview. He immediately was shushed by his Columbus lawyer, Jerry Weiner. Even more recently, Novell restated his charges against Garrison in a byline story carried by the Dayton Daily News. Cryptically, he said, "I think Garrison will expose some CIA operations in Louisiana." He did not elaborate. His oft-repeated but unpublished account of how the explosives disappeared describes the bunker he says he helped empty as a CIA staging point for munitions destined to be used as part of the abortive Bay of Pigs attack on Castro's Cuba in April of '61. Okay, so that's false because those weapons never got to the Cubans. They got funneled to the Israelis via Inter-Armco out of Virginia. So that's how that happened. Prior to that disaster CIA staged operation, Novell says he was working for the intelligence service at New Orleans. Part of his job, he contends, was to operate the Evergreen Advertising Agency as a front for CIA communications. With funds funneled to him by CIA, Novell said he prepared special radio commercials used on 300 stations in the U.S. and Canada. Their cryptographic messages, he claims, were to alert agents to the invasion date. The commercials advertised aluminum Christmas trees, he said, and the key alert code names were Star Christmas trees and holiday trees. In late 1960, $72,000 worth of radio time was placed by the agency. On the day the munitions were to be picked up, he says, he was called by his CIA contact and told to join a group which he was ordered to transport munitions from the bunker to New Orleans. And so the bunker being down in Homa, which I actually visited and took pictures at. Small little nondescript building. But yes, Novell ends up telling everything because, well, he was probably scared. Probably made some promises. But the information he gave checks out from other sources, like the information on Inter-Armco and how the munitions never went to the fucking Cubans. They went to Inter-Armco. So they jacked all the stuff from Homa. It got stored at Guy Bannister's place in New Orleans. Then shipped up to Virginia, sold to Inter-Armco, and then the weapons ended up making their way to the Israelis to fight the Palestinians. So, I'm going to skip over the rest of that article. This is another memorandum, May 14th, 1969. Reference Bannister, reference Ray Huff. Reference CIA, reference Thornley, reference Ferry. To Jim Garrison from Andrew Scambra. Reference Shaw Leads 2. Al Campbell circled. Today I interviewed Al Campbell, who told me that he worked for Bannister around 1958 and 1959 and again around 1962 and 1963. He said he did everything for Bannister, which ranged from investigator to undercover work trying to get information on communist groups in the city. He said that Bannister liked him and gave him the keys to his files. However, he said there were some files that only Bannister had access to. He said that Celia Pizzo knew Bannister very well and may be able to give us some information. He said that he never saw Shaw with Oswald or Ferry or Bannister. He said that Joan Burton was a secretary for Bannister in 1962 and may be able to give us some information about the files. He says that he remembers Tiger Jim Ivey, whose name came up in connection with the Friends of Democratic Cuba, and Bob Grant as two people who were working undercover with Bannister. He says that he remembers these two individuals because they were bad actors and were capable of doing anything. He said that both have New Orleans police records and both are ex-Marines. Campbell said that Bannister worked closely with Ray Huff and the CIA and had a lot to do with the overthrow of President Arbenez of Guatemala. Campbell said that Bannister worked closely with both CIA and the FBI. Campbell said that in September of 1959, he helped train the Guatemalan airborne for President Fuentes in Guatemala. Campbell said that Tiger Jim Ivey was an ex-boxer who worked as a barker at the El Morocco bar on Bourbon Street. Campbell said that he was with Thornley and Carl, I can't read that. Looks like Rocha, R-O-C-H, in the Bourbon House. Remember, Thornley in the Bourbon House. Anytime you see an Oswald sighting at the Bourbon House, it was Thornley, by people who didn't know Thornley. Kind of funny how that worked. He said that Thornley had told him in the presence of, or is it Boch, B-O-C-H, however the fuck you pronounce that. He said that Thornley knew Oswald in New Orleans. Thornley said that he disagreed with the newspaper reporter about Oswald in New Orleans and said that Oswald was in New Orleans more times than the paper stated. Thornley said that he wrote a book about Oswald, and Oswald either saw him or stayed with him while he was in New Orleans. Thornley also told Campbell and Boch, while looking at television reports on the assassination, that, quote, it could not have happened to a nicer guy, referring to Kennedy. Boch then got angry at Thornley and told him to shut up. All right, next one. It says, I have a bunch of scribbled notes on here, a bunch of stuff crossed off. But it says, to Archives re CIA. And there's a letter here to Jim Garrison. Who is this from? I guess we will find out. Please lay this letter in front of you and study it very thoroughly. It may save your life. I have reason to believe the circumstances are arranged so that if 2 more pieces of evidence are made known, you may be left as the only link to public disclosure of the complete and entire disclosure of the conspiracy which resulted in the late President Kennedy's death. Facts which I am sure you have now read only 2 pieces of evidence, need only 2 pieces of evidence to complete the picture. One, something with the unexplained suicide of prominent man from San Francisco immediately following a visit there by Mr. Shaw. This man was in the travel agency business and jumped off one of the city's most famous hotels. Proof that Oswald was employed by the CIA has all been destroyed except for one small link. The CIA furnished Oswald with classified information which no one else could possibly give him. 2 letters exist which tell him what these were. They exempted him alone, out of 23 other suspects, from investigation in the Walker shooting attempt. They thought he was working in the interests of the USA. His mother stated immediately after his arrest that Lee worked for the CIA. He told her to explain the large amount of money he had to finance his expensive travels, and it was the truth. A conversation held 1/1968 with subject claiming to be an ex-CIA agent, assisted Garrison. As per request, lists of Oswald's possessions and copy of page from address book with word microdots were supplied to subject. Some of the listed items elicited a greater on lesser degree of interest. Those items were pills, tweezers, iodine, white powder, scrap of paper, telescope, Minox camera, stereo realist camera, 7x18 sunbeam glasses, Russian transistor radio, unknown electronic device in plastic case, pedometer. More detailed analysis follows. Pills. During the early 60s, pills were a common espionage tool in which to pack chemical compounds used for developing undetectable writing. They could also be swallowed if necessary, since they were also physiologically innocuous. Subject says they are no longer in wide usage. They retain their potency, and chemical analysis could be highly revealing, assuming something to find. If totally confiscated by the agency, he feels they would have been destroyed or substituted for by now. Tweezer could be used to grasp microdot film sliver. Just for clarification, a microdot is an extremely small like photographic negative that would fit underneath a postage stamp. He additionally commented that microdots the size of periods would be impractical, that they are in fact larger and placed between sliced down single pages of books or between layers of postcard. He again suggested careful perusal of any books in Oswald's possession, especially oversized books and or any books with missing pages. Iodine could be used as a vapor to develop undetectable writing, such as writing with clear water. White powders, similar to pills, or possibly special glue needed to restore layers of microdot-containing pages. Scrap of paper, common white bond paper, is a type used for undetectable writing. Telescope, 15 power, could be camera-mounted for long-range photography, especially if person's point is weak, though, since most telescopes of this type are in the range of 100 power. Could also be used, however, to focus upon and read a microdot, perhaps in line with a series of lenses. Stereorealist camera, primarily used for aerial photography, although not completely out of the realm of possibility of home use. The abundance of cameras in Oswald's possession is suspect. However, the word topography with the name and address of Jaggers Child Stovall was painted with the word microdot, seemingly curiously and possibly significant to subject. His opinion, if Oswald, this is handwritten, his opinion, if Oswald in Russia on espionage work, he would not be used for mission in USA. Oswald, or he would not be used for mission in Cuba. Oswald's Castro connections were a cover. That's an opinion. Interesting. 1 7x18 sunbeam glasses. Unclear on Dallas PD list. Subject surmises these are either binoculars or a microscope. The operative fact here is that the ocular lens power, 7x18, equals, looks like 126 power, just about perfect for reading microdots. Preferable range is 800 to 200 power. 126 is considered excellent level. Microscope would be more incriminating than binoculars, suggests determining exactly what this item is. Pedometer could be used at a low level of espionage to measure point-to-point distances. Russian transistor radio. These are modified and used to send or receive or locked in wave bands, especially true of U.S.-Cuba communications, which wave bands radio would be important to determine, as would be the addition or subtraction of any crystals within the radio. Unknown electronic device. Subject questions how the Dallas PD knew it was electronic. Such small, quote, devices could be used in conjunction with radio message receiver. Only personal inspection could determine this. Minox camera. Item of greatest interest of subject. One of two or three cameras used for microdot work. Possession of same in Eastern Europe is in itself sufficient to deny egress across borders. If it could be determined when Oswald purchased some, it then might be determined if he had it when in Russia, which would be extremely suspect. Value of camera is its size, infinite focus capability, and resolution, most often used to photograph documents or pages on a book at a distance of approximately 36 inches. Further discussion with subject revealed that he was a delegate to an international students' convention held in Japan at the time of the anti-Eisenhower riots. Check dates. He has just recently returned from living and serving in Europe with his wife. While there was little printed re-assassination, according to him, an explanation for his rather late developing interest as to why the agency would release him if he were indebted so highly trained and knowledgeable. He explained that microdots were not his primary area of responsibility, but rather that he became an expert on them while working on related projects undisclosed. He also feels that the agency may one day, quote, tap him on the shoulder and ask him to look into something for them. He will contact friends, agents in Japan, re Oswald's training and classification. Therefore, he also said some friends were in Dallas, a quote, few days after the assassination. And he will contact these persons in an attempt to elicit any information which they might want to give. Regarding the alleged CIA polygraph testing of Ferry, the general line of questioning would encompass three distinct areas. Have you told anyone what you are doing? Exactly what have you done with the funds advanced to you? Why do you want to get involved? Finally, subject said he is willing to visit the National Archives in order to examine any materials, but would have to know beforehand exactly how any information garnered there could be used. Really fucking interesting, huh? Really interesting. All right, next up. Memorandum, May 14th, 69. Reference Bannister, Huff, CIA, Thornley, and Ferry once again. Or is this a duplicate? I think we might have a duplicate here, folks. Nope, it just starts off very similarly. So, this is from from Scambria to Jim Garrison. Shaw leads 2. Today I interviewed Al Campbell, who told me that he worked for Bannister from 58 to 59 and again around 62 and 63. He said he did everything for Bannister, which ranged from investigator to undercover work, trying to get information on communist groups in the city. He said that Bannister liked him and gave him the keys to his files. However, he said there were some files that only Bannister had access to. He said that Celia Pizzo knew Bannister very well and may be able to give us some information. He said that he never saw Shaw or Oswald or Ferry or Bannister. He said that Joanne Burton was a secretary for Bannister in 1962 and may be able to give us some information about the files. He says that he remembers Tiger Jim Ivey, whose name came up in connection with the Friends of Democratic Cuba, and Bob Grant as 2 people who were working undercover with Bannister. Okay, we read that part. Campbell said Bannister worked closely with Ray Huff and the CIA and had a lot to do with the overthrow of Arbanez in Guatemala. Campbell said that he also knew Ferry from the Lakefront Airport. He said that he's never seen Ferry with Shaw. He said that when Ferry's picture appeared in the paper in regards to our investigation, Ferry told him, "I'm a dead man." Campbell said that he and his brother Dan were in the Bethlehem Orphans Home and were there around the same time that Oswald was, around 46. Campbell said he remembers seeing John Meadows somewhere around the corner, possibly with Thornley. He also said there was a CIA man who worked closely with Bannister by the name of Jim. This person also worked as an announcer for WNOE. Campbell said that he also knows Gordon Novell and introduced Novell to Marlene Mancuso. I don't know that name. Campbell also kept asking if we ever talked with Beaubouf. Alvin Beaubouf. He seems to believe that Beaubouf can help us. Beaubouf won't help anybody because Beaubouf knows everything. He also asked if there was a possibility that we may have Shaw and Bannister mixed up. I told him that we would check out some of the information he gave us and contact him again, and said he would be glad to help. Campbell admitted that he seemed to have come in contact with many of the people whose names have come up in our investigation. He said that he would try to think of anything that would be of benefit for us and can be reached at the Flight Incorporated at Lakefront Airport. That's some really good stuff there. That's some good stuff. All right, we have some more duplication here. More stuff on Bill Dalzell, but I don't remember if we talked about Betty Parrott. No, because we mentioned Regis Kennedy here. So, all right, this should be good stuff. Memorandum, April 1st, 67, reference Shaw Dalzell Group, CIA, and Shaw in Italy. To Jim Garrison from Andrew Scambria, Assistant District Attorney. On March 31st, 1967, I interviewed Betty Parrott and learned from her that she had an extremely close relationship with Bill Dalzell. It seems that Bill Dalzell lived in her home for a certain period of time. During the time that Bill Dalzell lived in her home, she said that she was involved with a group known as the Friends of Cuba. This group had its office at the Balmer Building. That's 544 Camp Street. Members of the group included Sergio Arcacha Smith, Bill Craig, Bill Dalzell, Grady Durham, an individual named Logan, who was also a member of the CIA, Bill Klein, an attorney, Regis Kennedy, a member of the FBI, an individual named Hoffman, and an individual named Easterling. She said that although Dalzell was very secretive about the operation of the group, she said that from the conversations that she overheard over a period of time, she learned that the group was involved in an undercover operation in conjunction with the CIA and FBI, which involved the shipment and transportation of individuals and supplies in and out of Cuba. She said that many times Regis Kennedy would come over to the house and talk to Dalzell concerning the operation. She also said that many times Regis Kennedy came to the office in the Balter building to talk to Dalzell, and in turn, Dalzell and other members of the group visited Regis Kennedy in his office. She said that Regis Kennedy confirmed to her the fact that Clay Shaw is a former CIA agent who did some work for the CIA in Italy over a 5-year span. She said this group later moved from their office in the Balter building and moved into an office in the International Trade Mart, and then operated under the name of the Voice of Cuba or the Friends of Democratic Cuba. She said that she does not know whether or not Clay Shaw had any connection with this group, and that she does not remember hearing Clay Shaw's name mentioned. She said that Bill Dalzell could tell us everything about the group and about the connection with Regis Kennedy and the CIA. She said that Bill Dalzell has an open charge against him in New York, which she believes is gun theft. She said that Joe Bolden has the entire file on Bill Dalzell and can give us all the information we need in regard to this charge. She said for some reason she has heard Bill Dalzell's name mentioned quite often since the investigation started. She said that approximately 2 weeks ago, Dalzell made a trip into New Orleans and spoke to Steve Plotkin and heard he left town. All right, more duplication here. We have a random article. I can't read the headline. It says re-CIA and in parentheses, Ruth Payne family. Aid shields intelligence work in Laos. Washington, Associated Press, Foreign Aid Chief John A. Hanna acknowledged Sunday that the U.S. aid program is being used as a cover for CIA operations in Laos. He said President Nixon may propose divorcing such intelligence work from overseas economic assistance in the future. Well, I just have to admit that it is true, Hanna said when asked if the program, his aid administering agency for the international development, is being used as a cover for CIA operations in Laos. Hanna was questioned on the Metro Media radio news program Profile. Central Intelligence Agency and other U.S. activities in Laos were already recently in Senate inquiry headed by Senator Stuart Symington, Democrat, Missouri. But it is rare for an executive branch official to acknowledge publicly that his organization is being used for undercover work abroad. Nixon spelled out U.S. aid in Laos in a March 6th statement, which did not mention the CIA. U.S. activities were previously had been kept hush-hush to avoid impairing the Vientiane government's neutral status. Hanna made plain he disapproved of the CIA's use of his agency. He said Laos is the only place this is being done, and that it right, and that it stems from a 1962 decision that such activity was in the U.S. national interest. Certainly our preference is to get rid of this kind of operation, he said. Hanna said he is sure that Nixon will include such a recommendation in the foreign aid reorganization ideas that President plans to present soon for congressional discussion. Well, obviously none of that shit fucking happened, right? Fuck it. Look at USAID today. Fuck. I hope it's going to be in the new aid legislation once that is submitted, Hanna added. Hanna generally favored splitting economic foreign development activities from these political military operations, which he said ought to be handled by the State Department and the Defense Department rather than through AID. Like I just said, USAID is the new iteration. He said the drafting of AID specialists from the other parts of the world for a year's duty in Vietnam has complicated our program all over the world, and I would recommend separation. Hanna, I can't read that middle part, agreed with the president's task force on foreign something headed by Rudolph Anderson, which had proposed an merging of AID, its major funding, and making international, looks like diplomatic development programs independent of foreign aid designed for U.S. security. He said what is important is a long-term U.S. commitment to carrying a fair share of the burden to help developing countries at the level of U.S. economic assistance should be granted substantially above its something, and that's that. But up here it says clearly that Ruth Paine's family. So this is just showing a connection between Ruth Paine and the CIA. Okay, so another memo. June 26, 1967, to Jim Garrison from Tom Bethel, referenced CIA files on assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald has been variously described as a loner, a nut, and a crackpot, and yet fact remains that less than 6 weeks before the assassination, the man who was alleged to have killed the president was under surveillance by both the FBI and CIA. The FBI's prior knowledge of Oswald's activities was revealed by the Warren Commission's inquiry, but to our knowledge, CIA have not admitted that they, too, possessed a file on Oswald before the assassination. Yet we know this to be the case. A notarized affidavit by State Department officer James W. Crowley stated that the first time I remember learning of Oswald's existence was when I received copies of a telegraphic message dated October 10th, 1963 from the CIA, which contained information pertaining to his current activities. The contents of this message apparently did not reach the Warren Commission because there are no commission documents originating from the CIA dated prior to the assassination, so we cannot request this information by document number, but it would be interesting to know what the CIA knew about Oswald 6 weeks before the assassination. The following 29 commission documents are classified as CIA files, selected from a total list of 51 classified CIA files on the assassination in the National Archives. These are all listed as numbered CD 321 through CD 1551. I think I can breeze through these pretty quickly. Chronology of Oswald in the Soviet Union, activity of Oswald in Mexico City, another one on activity of Oswald in Mexico City, interrogations of Sylvia Duran in Mexico City. Sylvia Duran being the woman who dealt with Oswald at the consulate. She got arrested and fucked and all kinds of stuff, I'm sure. Allegation Oswald interviewed by CIA in Mexico City. So there's an allegation that Oswald was interviewed by the CIA in Mexico City. Interesting, because we know it was Kerry Thornley in Mexico City, and there's no reason he wouldn't have met with the CIA down there. Reference CIA dissemination of information on Oswald. Info given to the Secret Service, but not yet given to the Warren Commission. Appendix to CD 321, a couple of appendixes. Reproduction of CIA official dossier on Oswald. Reports of travel and activities of Oswald and Marina. Reply to question posed by State Department. Actions of Sylvia Duran after first interrogation. Revisions, photos of Oswald in Russia. Oswald's access to information about the U-2. Role of Cuban intelligence service in processing visa application. Allegations of PFC Eugene Dinkin. Re-assassination plot. That'll have to get into another time. Telephone calls to U.S. Embassy Canberra, replanned assassination. Mexican interrogation of Gilberto Alvarado. George and Jean de Mohrenschildt, allegations re-intelligence training school in Minsk. Information on Jack Ruby and Associates, letter re-assassination sent to Costa Rican embassy. That's interesting. Memo from Helms entitled Lee Harvey Oswald. Statements by George de Mohrenschildt, re-assassination. Memo from Helms, re-apparent inconsistencies in info provided by CIA. Re-Oswald, an affidavit concerning cropped picture. Conversation between Cuban president and ambassador. All right, so we're coming up on something good here. The statement and interrogation of Martin L. McAuliffe, Jr. in the office of the district attorney on Tuesday, May 9th, 1967. But I am going to save this for the next episode. We're about halfway through this CIA file. And Martin McAuliffe, it's kind of funny we come across this name because Martin McAuliffe has only recently popped onto my radar as being most certainly a CIA handler of both Kerry Thornley and Sergei Arcacha. So we will pick this up next time. The book is going to be done really soon. I don't really like talking about it too much. I just want to get it done. It will be out before the end of the month for sure. And today is the 16th. So if you haven't pre-ordered it yet, please go to my website, coryhughes.org, and click the links there, or go to buymeacoffee.com/JFK Book and pre-order the book. You'll get with it my notes and all that stuff. And yeah, we got poster available, limited edition of 100. You can pick up one of those. So yeah, things are moving along. The book's moving along. I'm in the final editing and formatting phase, which will be finished, I'm praying to God, by Friday. And that'll do it. So I appreciate everybody tuning in today. And I will probably, today's Sunday night. I will probably have another one of these Wednesday or Thursday. And we'll conclude this file on the Central Intelligence Agency at that time. Thanks, everybody.